The Korthax Empire had crushed 17 star systems in 2 years. Their black ships moved like death itself through space, leaving only empty worlds and broken metal behind. Every race that faced them either died fighting or ran away screaming. The lizard-like warriors were known across the galaxy for their cruel ways and their plasma weapons that could melt through any armor, like butter through bread. Admiral Zethkar stood tall on the bridge of his massive warship, the Shadowblade. His yellow eyes looked at the star map showing all the worlds they had taken. Red dots marked dead civilizations, and there were many red dots. His scaled hands traced the paths of conquest, each line representing millions of lives snuffed out, like candles in a storm. The bridge around him buzzed with activity as his crew prepared for the next attack. Korthax warriors moved with deadly purpose, their claws clicking on metal floors, their forked tongues tasting the air for weakness. They had done this dance of destruction so many times that it had become routine. Find a world, break its defenses, take what they wanted, and move on to the next target. 3 human colonies had fallen in the past week alone. The humans had surprised everyone by lasting longer than most species, but in the end, they died just like all the others. Their ships burned, their cities crumbled, and their people either fled or became dust. Zethkar had expected more from the species that claimed to rule this section of space, but disappointment was common in his line of work. His tactical officer approached with quick steps. The younger Korthax warrior kept his head low in respect. As he spoke, "Sir, we are getting close to the Terra Nova system. Our spies tell us there are many human warships there." Zethkar showed his teeth in what his species called a smile, though it looked more like a threat display to most other races. "Good. Let us show these soft mammals why entire worlds empty when they hear our name whispered in the dark." Far away in the cold depths of space, Captain Jake Morrison walked back and forth on the bridge of his ship. The USS Defiance was a tight, heavy cruiser, one of the newest and most powerful ships in the human fleet. Her metal hull gleamed under the light of distant stars, and her weapons could punch holes through mountains. But Morrison knew that all the firepower in the galaxy meant nothing without the right crew to use it. His weathered face told the story of many battles. Scars ran across his cheek from a Korthax plasma blast during the defense of New Boston. His steel-gray eyes had seen friends die and enemies fall, and they held the kind of hardness that only came from years of war. He had fought in 3 major conflicts, and lived to tell about each one, which was more than most soldiers could say. Lieutenant Amy Rodriguez sat at the sensor station, her fingers dancing over the controls like a piano player performing a deadly song. She had been with Morrison for 2 years now, and he trusted her eyes more than any computer. When she spoke, her voice was calm but carried an edge of worry. "Captain, long-range sensors are picking up big energy readings coming our way. It looks like a Korthax fleet, and sensors count 47 ships total. They are coming from the direction of Proxima Centauri." Morrison stopped walking and stood very still. 47 ships against 1 was not good odds by any measure. The rest of the Third Fleet had been scattered across multiple star systems, trying to slow down the Korthax advance wherever they could. Command had hoped to buy time for the outer colonies to evacuate, but time was running out fast. He looked around his bridge at the faces of his crew. These men and women had followed him through hell more times than he could count. They had faced impossible odds before, and somehow lived to fight another day. But 47 enemy warships was beyond impossible. It was insane. Chief Engineer Danny Walsh checked his readings from the engine room deep in the ship's belly. The big man had served with Morrison since the beginning, and his hands knew every bolt and wire in the Defiance like a father knows his children. Next to him, Petty Officer Lisa Chen worked on the experimental shield systems that made their ship special. "Captain wants us ready for a big fight," Walsh said, as he adjusted power levels. 47 Korthax ships against just us. Lisa looked up from her work with a small smile. "Remember what happened at Kepler Station when they said 12 enemy cruisers were too many? We made them regret that mistake." Walsh laughed, despite knowing how bad their situation was. True enough, kid. If we are going to die today, let us make sure they remember why they should fear humans. Back on the bridge, Morrison made his choice. Running away would save his ship and crew, but it would also doom the Terra Nova system and everyone living there. The Korthax would kill millions of innocent people, and the human fleet would lose another strategic position. Sometimes a captain had to choose between the smart thing and the right thing. Set course for the enemy fleet, Morrison ordered. Full speed ahead. The bridge crew looked at him with surprise, but they followed orders without question. They knew their captain, and they trusted his judgment, even when it seemed crazy. The Defiance turned toward the approaching enemy, like a lone wolf facing a pack of hungry bears. Lieutenant Commander Rick Barnes, their best pilot, felt the ship respond to his commands. Course set, Captain. The enemy will see us in 20 minutes. Morrison nodded and opened a channel to the entire ship. His voice carried to every deck and every compartment where his people waited for battle. This is the captain speaking. In a few minutes, we will face 47 enemy warships, with nothing but our skill, our courage, and our refusal to give up. The odds are against us, but odds have never stopped humans before. We are the USS Defiance, and today, we live up to our name. The Korthax fleet came out of hyperspace like a cloud of metal death. Their ships formed perfect attack patterns that had worked against every enemy they had ever faced. Zethkar expected the single human ship to either run away or die quickly in a hopeless last stand. Instead, the USS Defiance flew straight toward them, with engines burning bright as stars. The Korthax fleet dropped out of hyperspace in a formation that had conquered 17 star systems. 47 warships arranged themselves like the fingers of a giant metal hand, ready to crush anything that stood in their way. Each ship was a masterpiece of destruction, covered in armor that could stop most weapons and bristling with plasma. Cannons that burned hotter than the surface of a star. Admiral Zethkar stood on his command deck and watched the tactical display with satisfaction. The human system lay before them like a ripe fruit ready for picking. 3 planets full of soft mammals who thought their technology could save them from the inevitable. He had seen this same scene dozens of times before, and it always ended the same way. But something was wrong with this picture. Instead of running away or hiding behind their planet's defenses, a single human warship was moving toward his entire fleet. The ship was big by human standards, but it looked like a tiny metal fish swimming toward a school of sharks. Zeth had to admire the courage, even as he prepared to crush it. His communications officer turned toward him with confusion written on his reptilian features. Admiral, the human ship is sending us a message. Zethkar's forked tongue flicked out to taste the air. In all his years of conquest, enemy ships usually sent desperate pleas for mercy or final insults before they died. This would be entertaining, at least. Put them on the main screen. Captain Morrison's face appeared before the assembled Korthax warriors. His human features looked soft compared to their scaled hides, but his eyes held something that made even veteran soldiers pause. There was no fear in those gray eyes, no desperation, no sign that he understood how hopeless his situation was. I am Captain Jake Morrison of the United Earth Navy, the human said in a calm voice that carried across the bridge like thunder. You are in violation of the Terran defense perimeter. Withdraw immediately, or face the consequences. The bridge fell silent for a moment before erupting in harsh laughter that sounded like rocks grinding together. Zethkar's officers slapped their claws against metal surfaces in amusement. Some of them made jokes in their native language about the tiny human who thought he could threaten them. Zethkar leaned forward in his command chair, his yellow eyes glowing with cruel humor. Human captain, you face the might of 40 warships with a single vessel. Your weapons cannot harm us, your shields cannot protect you, and your courage will not save you. Surrender now, and I promise your death will be quick and clean. Morrison's expression never changed. His voice remained steady as stone when he replied, "We don't surrender, and we don't run away from fights. You want this system, you will have to go through us first." The transmission ended, leaving the Korthax bridge staring at an empty screen. In all his years of conquest, Zethkar had never heard such words spoken with such quiet confidence. Most enemies either begged for mercy or screamed challenges they could not back up. This human simply stated facts, as if he was discussing the weather. Commander Vexton, his second in command, hissed softly through his teeth, "Admiral, should we proceed with standard attack formation?" Zethkar nodded slowly, but something nagged at the back of his mind. The human captain had not sounded like someone facing impossible odds. He had sounded like someone who knew exactly what he was doing. "Begin the assault, but keep our ship spread out. I want to see what tricks these mammals have before we close in for the kill." Deep inside the USS Defiance, the crew prepared for a battle that should have been their last. Chief Engineer Walsh moved through the engine room like a man possessed, checking every system and making sure every circuit was ready for the fight of their lives. The experimental gravity systems that made their ship special had never been tested in real combat, and today would prove whether human engineering was as good as human courage. Petty Officer Chen worked beside him, her hand steady despite knowing what they faced. "Danny, do you really think we can win against 47 ships?" Walsh paused in his work and looked at her with eyes that had seen too much war. "Kid, I have been fighting alongside Captain Morrison for 5 years now. I have seen him do things that should have been impossible. If anyone can figure out how to win this fight, it is him." On the bridge, Lieutenant Rodriguez watched her sensors as the enemy fleet began to move. The Korthax ships were spreading out in a pattern designed to surround them and attack from all sides at once. It was a smart tactic that had worked against every opponent they had ever faced. "Captain, they are moving into attack formation," she reported. "Estimated time to weapons range is 3 minutes. Morrison studied the tactical display with the eyes of a man who had fought more battles than he could count. The enemy was doing exactly what he had hoped they would do. Their formation was spread out to prevent his ship from concentrating fire, but it also meant their own firepower would be scattered. Chief Tactical Officer Kelly Wright ran final checks on their weapons systems. The Defiance carried enough firepower to level a city, but against 47 enemy warships, it would have to be used very carefully. Every shot would have to count, and every miss could mean death for them all. "All weapons ready, Captain," she reported. "Quantum torpedoes loaded, and plasma cannons charged to full power." Lieutenant Commander Barnes felt the ship respond to his touch like a living thing. The experimental systems that other pilots found confusing felt natural to him after years of practice. He could make the Defiance dance through space in ways that seemed to break the laws of physics. But today he would need every trick he had ever learned. Dr. Patricia Miles waited in sickbay for the wounded that would surely come. She had served on 3 different ships with Morrison, and she knew how he fought. He would push his people to their limits and beyond, but he would also bring most of them home alive. Her job was to make sure they stayed that way. The first plasma bolts lit up space like deadly fireworks. The Korthax had opened fire at maximum range, more to test their enemy than to cause serious damage. The bright energy beams streaked across the darkness toward the lone human ship, each one carrying enough power to melt through a building. Morrison watched the incoming fire with calm eyes. Rick, evasive maneuvers. Kelly, returned fire with forward tubes. The USS Defiance suddenly twisted to one side in a movement that should have been impossible for such a large ship. The enemy plasma beams passed harmlessly through empty space, while 4 quantum torpedoes streaked back toward the Korthax formation. Each torpedo found its target, and 4 enemy ships vanished in balls of nuclear fire. On his flagship, Zethkar gripped his command chair as the bridge shook from the shock waves of dying ships. In 30 seconds of combat, the humans had done something no enemy had managed in 2 years of war. They had hurt his fleet. How did they move like that? He demanded. No ship that size should be able to change direction so quickly. His tactical officer studied the sensor readings with growing alarm. Sir, their ship appears to be using some kind of gravity manipulation technology. They are somehow reducing their inertia while maintaining structural integrity. Zethkar's eyes narrowed to yellow slits. The humans had been hiding new technology, waiting for the right moment to reveal it. This was not going to be the easy victory he had expected. The single human warship was not just refusing to die, it was fighting back with weapons and tactics they had never seen before. The battle was just beginning, but already everything had changed. The space around Terra Nova turned into a deadly light show as 43 Korthax warships unleashed everything they had at the lone human vessel. Plasma beams crossed the darkness like burning spears, each one hot enough to melt steel and powerful enough to crack mountains. The combined firepower of the alien fleet could have turned a planet's surface into glass. But somehow, the USS Defiance danced between the deadly streams of energy like a leaf in a hurricane. Lieutenant Commander Barnes had his hands welded to the flight controls, his eyes locked on the tactical display that showed death coming from every direction. Sweat ran down his face as he twisted the ship through impossible turns and spirals, using every trick he had learned in 15 years of military flying. The experimental gravity systems screamed under the strain, but they held together and kept his people alive. Coming around to bearing 270, he called out through gritted teeth. This is going to be a rough one. The Defiance rolled completely upside down and dove toward the enemy formation like a hawk after prey. Plasma bolts missed her hull by meters, leaving trails of superheated gas in space. One beam passed so close that it actually scorched the paint off her portside armor. But the ship kept flying and kept fighting. Chief Tactical Officer Kelly Wright had her weapons locked on 3 different targets at once. Her fingers moved over the firing controls like a concert pianist playing a deadly song. The quantum torpedo tubes were loaded and ready, and the plasma cannons were charged to maximum power. I have clear shots on their lead cruiser and 2 destroyers, she reported to Morrison, requesting permission to fire. Captain Morrison watched the tactical display with the cold calculation of a man who had fought too many battles to count. The enemy formation was tight, which meant a single spread of torpedoes could hit multiple targets if aimed correctly. But it also meant his ship would be exposed to concentrated return fire for several crucial seconds. Fire all tubes, he ordered. Full spread, pattern delta. 6 quantum torpedoes streaked away from the Defiance like bolts of controlled lightning. Each one carried enough destructive power to level a city block, and they flew toward their targets with electronic precision. The lead Kordax cruiser tried to turn away, but the massive ship was too slow to escape. The first torpedo hit its forward shield generator, the second punched through its weakened armor, and the third detonated deep inside its hull. The explosion lit up space like a small sun being born. Chunks of alien metal scattered in all directions as the cruiser came apart, like a broken toy. The 2 destroyers died almost as quickly, their smaller hulls unable to absorb the devastating impact of nuclear fire. Admiral Zethkar felt his flagship shake as debris from the dead ships bounced off its armored hull. In less than 5 minutes of combat, he had lost 7 warships to a single human vessel. 7 ships, full of trained warriors who had conquered star systems, were now nothing but glowing wreckage, drifting in space. How are they doing this? He roared at his tactical officer. No single ship should be able to fight like this. Commander Vexton studied the sensor readings with growing fear. The human ship was moving in ways that broke every rule of space combat he had ever learned. Ships that size were supposed to be slow and clumsy, easy targets for smaller and faster vessels. But this one twisted and turned like a fighter craft while hitting back with the firepower of a battleship. Sir, I believe. Their gravity manipulation technology allows them to ignore normal physics, he reported. They can change direction without worrying about inertia, which means they can avoid our weapons while keeping theirs pointed at us. Deep inside the USS Defiance, Chief Engineer Walsh fought his own battle against the laws of physics. The gravity generators were running at 110% of their rated capacity, and warning lights flashed red throughout the engine room. Sparks flew from overloaded circuits while the smell of burning insulation filled the air. How are we holding up? Petty Officer Chen shouted over the noise of protesting machinery. Walsh wiped sweat from his face and checked. Another readout. The good news is that everything is still working. The bad news is that I have no idea how long we can keep this up. These systems were never designed for this kind of punishment. On the bridge, Lieutenant Rodriguez tracked 43 enemy contacts on her sensors while trying not to think about the impossible odds they faced. Each red dot on her screen represented a warship full of alien warriors who wanted nothing more than to see her and her shipmates dead. But somehow, against all logic and reason, they were still alive and still fighting. Captain, the enemy is changing formation, she called out. They are spreading out to try and surround us. Morrison nodded grimly. The Korthax admiral was learning from his mistakes and adapting his tactics. The tight formation that had made them vulnerable to torpedo attacks was gone, replaced by a loose circle that would let them attack from all sides at once. It was exactly what Morrison would have done in the same situation. Rick, take us toward their left flank, he ordered. Kelly, prepare the port batteries for close-range combat. The Defiance turned toward the nearest group of enemy ships like a shark smelling blood in the water. The aliens had spread out to avoid concentrated torpedo fire, but that also meant they could not support each other as effectively. Morrison planned to take advantage of that weakness by hitting isolated groups of ships before they could coordinate their response. The battle had been raging for 2 hours when the first Korthax captain broke formation and ran. The destroyer, Nightwind, had taken a direct hit from a quantum torpedo and was venting atmosphere from a dozen hull breaches. Instead of staying to fight, its captain ordered a retreat jump to hyperspace. Within minutes, 2 more ships followed his example. The Korthax Empire had built its reputation on being unstoppable, but the USS Defiance was proving that reputation wrong. For the first time in their military history, Korthax warriors were afraid. Admiral Zethkar watched his fleet slowly fall apart with growing horror. He had started the battle with 47 warships and absolute confidence in victory. Now he was down to 38 ships, and some of his captains were starting to panic. The single human vessel continued to fight with a skill and determination that seemed impossible. Dr. Miles worked frantically in sickbay as the first wounded started arriving. A plasma beam had punched through the ship's armor on Deck 7, and 3 crew members had been caught in the blast. She fought to save their lives while the ship shook around her from enemy fire and violent maneuvers. "How bad is it out there?" asked Chief Petty Officer Tony Martinez as she bandaged his burned arm. Miles looked up from her work with eyes that had seen too much combat. "We are still alive, which means the captain is working miracles on the bridge. Just focus on healing up so you can get back to your station." The USS Defiance had taken damage during the long battle. Her hull was scarred by plasma burns, her shields were down to 30% power, and smoke filled several compartments. But she continued to fight with the stubborn determination that had always marked human warriors. Every time the aliens thought they had her cornered, she would twist away and strike back with deadly precision. Lieutenant Commander Barnes felt the ship respond more slowly to his commands as damaged systems struggled to keep working. The gravity generators were running hot, and he could feel their protests through the flight controls. But the Defiance still danced through space like a thing alive, avoiding death by centimeters while dealing it out by the megaton. "Captain, I am reading stress fractures in the port gravity generator," he reported. If it fails, we lose half our maneuvering ability. Morrison absorbed this information without changing expression. Losing the gravity system would mean death for all of them, but worrying about it would not help. How long can it hold? Unknown, sir. Could be minutes or hours. The battle continued with deadly intensity as human technology and determination faced alien numbers and firepower. In the cold depths of space, legends were being written in fire and blood. The USS Defiance had already lasted longer than anyone thought possible, but the real test was still to come. 6 hours into the battle, something that had never happened before in Korthak's military history began to occur. Fear crept into the hearts of warriors who had never known defeat. The perfect formations that had crushed 17 star systems started to crack and bend as individual captains made choices based on survival rather than glory. The USS Defiance hung in space like a wounded but still dangerous predator. Her hull was black with plasma burns. Atmosphere leaked from dozens of breaches, and entire sections had been blown away by enemy fire. She looked like she should have died hours ago, but somehow she kept fighting with the same deadly skill that had already cost the Korthak's fleet 21 warships. Admiral Zethkar stood on his bridge and stared at the tactical display with eyes that held something he had never felt before. The single human ship had done the impossible by lasting this long, but more than that, she had broken something fundamental in his warriors. Ships that should have pressed their attack were hanging back at maximum range, afraid to close with an enemy that refused to die. Commander Vexton approached with careful steps, his scaled features showing the strain of the long battle. "Sir, Captain Morthok of the Bloodclaws requesting permission to withdraw. He reports critical damage to his weapon systems." Zethkar looked at the tactical readout for the Bloodclaw and saw that while the ship had taken some damage, it was still capable of fighting. The real problem was not mechanical, but mental. Captain Morthok was afraid, and fear was spreading through the fleet like a disease. "Denied," he growled. "Any captain who abandons this battle will face execution for cowardice." But even as he spoke the words, Zethkar knew that threats would not restore his warriors' confidence. They had seen 21 of their sister ships die while trying to kill a single enemy vessel. They had watched the impossible happen again and again as the human ship twisted away from certain death and struck back with precision that seemed almost supernatural. Inside the USS Defiance, Captain Morrison walked through corridors filled with smoke and the smell of burned circuits. Damage control teams worked frantically to keep critical systems online, while medics carried wounded crew members to safety. The ship was dying around them, but she was dying slowly and taking many enemies with her. He stopped at a viewport and looked out at the enemy formation. 26 Korthak's warships still surrounded his vessel, their weapons trained on his hull like the eyes of hungry predators. But something had changed in the way they moved. The aggressive confidence of the early battle was gone, replaced by cautious fear that kept them at long range. Chief Engineer Walsh met him in the corridor with a damage report that read like a medical examiner's notes on a corpse. "Captain, we have lost main power on decks 4 through 7. The port gravity generator is running on backup systems, and I cannot guarantee it will hold for another hour. Hull breaches on 12 different decks, and we are down to 40%. Atmospheric." Morrison read the report and handed it back without comment. By any reasonable measure, his ship should have surrendered hours ago, but reasonable measures did not apply to the USS Defiance or her crew. They had been pushed beyond human limits and found something inside themselves that even they had not known existed. "How long can we keep fighting?" he asked. Walsh managed a tired smile. "As long as you need us to, Captain. The ship might be falling apart, but the crew is still strong." On the bridge, Lieutenant Rodriguez tracked the enemy formation with sensors that worked only because Petty Officer Chen had rerouted power from life support systems. The air was thin and cold, but they could still breathe, and that was enough. Her readouts showed that several Korthak ships were moving away from the battle zone, their captains no longer willing to face the impossible. "Captain, I am reading hyperspace signatures," she reported. "3 more enemy ships are jumping away." Chief Tactical Officer Kelly Wright managed the ship's weapons from a console that sparked and smoked with each command input. Half her targeting systems were offline, and she was firing manually using backup sensors and pure instinct. Despite the damage, her shots still found their targets with deadly accuracy. "We have been fighting for 6 hours," she said to no one in particular. 6 hours against impossible odds, and we are still here. Lieutenant Commander Barnes felt the ship respond sluggishly to his commands as more systems failed around him. The gravity generators were running far beyond their design limits, and he could feel their protests through the flight controls. But the Defiant still moved like a living thing, still danced between enemy weapons with grace that seemed to mock the laws of physics. Dr. Miles worked in a sickbay that looked like a field hospital from ancient wars. Wounded crew members lay on stretchers in the corridors because there were not enough beds for everyone. She moved between them with hands that never stopped working and eyes that refused to show despair. The battle had cost them dearly in blood and machinery, but it had also revealed something about human nature that surprised even the humans themselves. When pushed beyond their limits, when faced with certain death, they did not break. Instead, they became something more than they had been before. Admiral Zethkar received reports from his remaining captains with growing disbelief. The human ship should have been destroyed hours ago, but somehow it continued to fight with skill that seemed to improve rather than diminish as the battle wore on. His own flagship bore scars from precise strikes that had punched through shields and armor like they were paper. "Sir," his communications officer reported with a voice that shook slightly, "Captain Vaxinos of the Star Ripper is requesting immediate medical evacuation. His ship took a direct hit from a quantum torpedo." Zep looked at the tactical display and saw that the Star Ripper was indeed badly damaged. Her hull split open like a broken egg, but she was the 4th ship in the last hour to request withdrawal from combat, and he was beginning to understand that fear was destroying his fleet more effectively than human weapons. The Korthax Empire had built its power on the belief that they were unstoppable, that no force in the galaxy could stand against their military might. That belief had carried them through 17 successful conquests and made them the terror of civilized space. But belief was a fragile thing, and the USS Defiance was shattering it piece by piece. On his command deck, Zethkar made a decision that would have been unthinkable that morning. For the first time in his military career, he began to consider the possibility of retreat. Not because his fleet lacked the firepower to destroy the human ship, but because the cost of victory had become too high. The single human vessel had already cost him more ships than some entire campaigns. Worse than that, she had cost him something far more valuable: the absolute confidence of his warriors. Even if they eventually destroyed her, the survivors would carry the memory of this impossible battle with them forever. They would remember the day when a single human warship refused to die, and that memory would make them hesitate in future battles. Hesitation meant defeat, and defeat meant the end of the Korthax Empire as a galactic power. As the 7th hour of battle began, both sides faced the same terrible truth. The USS Defiance was slowly dying, but she was taking the myth of Korthak's invincibility with her into the grave. The 8th hour of battle began with a moment that would echo through galactic history. Admiral Zethkar stood on the bridge of his flagship and watched his once mighty fleet continue to fall apart ship by ship. The human vessel that should have died in the first few minutes of combat was still alive, still fighting, and still dealing death to his warriors with precision that bordered on the supernatural. 22 Korthax warships remained from the original 47, and Zeth could see the fear in his crew's eyes. These were veterans who had conquered worlds, warriors who had never known defeat, and now they moved with the careful hesitation of those who had learned that the impossible could happen. The USS Defiance looked like she had flown through the heart of a star. Her hull was black with plasma burns and torn open in dozens of places. Atmosphere vented from breaches that her crew could no longer seal, and entire sections had been blown away by enemy fire. She moved more slowly now, as damaged systems struggled to keep her alive, but she moved with the same deadly purpose that had marked her from the beginning. "All ships, concentrate fire on the human vessel," Zethkar commanded, his voice carrying the weight of desperation he could no longer hide. "Everything we have. I want that ship reduced to atoms." The remaining Korthax ships moved into firing position with reluctant obedience. They had been trying to destroy the human ship for 8 hours, and many of their sister ships had died in the attempt, but orders were orders, and they were still Korthax warriors, despite their fear. 22 warships opened fire at once, creating a storm of plasma energy that lit up space like a small galaxy being born. Every weapon that could bear on target unleashed its fury at the single human vessel that had defied them for so long. The combined firepower was enough to crack a moon, and it all focused on one scarred and dying ship. Captain Morrison felt the deck plates buckle under his feet as the massive barrage struck home. The USS Defiance shuddered like a living thing in pain as plasma beams punched through what remained of her shields and armor. Emergency lights flickered and died, leaving whole sections of the ship in darkness. The smell of burning metal and vaporized electronics filled the air. Lieutenant Commander Barnes fought to keep control as his flight systems failed one by one. The port gravity generator finally gave up with a sound like breaking thunder, and the ship listed to one side like a wounded bird trying to fly. But somehow, impossibly, they were still alive. "Damage report," Morrison called out, pulling himself upright as smoke swirled around the bridge. "Chief," Tactical Officer Kelly Wright looked up from a console that was more sparks than solid electronics. Her left arm hung useless at her side, blood running from a gash on her forehead, but her voice was steady as stone. "We are running on emergency power only. All weapons are offline, shields are completely gone, and we have lost primary propulsion. But we are still breathing," Lieutenant Rodriguez added from her damaged sensor station. "And according to my readings, so are most of the crew." The bridge fell silent, except for the sound of dying systems and the whisper of escaping atmosphere. By any measure, the USS Defiance was finished. She could no longer maneuver, could not fight back, and was slowly bleeding air into space. Any reasonable captain would have surrendered to save his crew's lives, but Captain Morrison was not a reasonable captain, and his crew were not reasonable people. They were humans, and humans had a reputation for doing unreasonable things when the situation called for it. They looked at their dying ship and their impossible situation, and they found something to smile about. "Well," Chief Engineer Walsh said over the comm system from his wrecked engine room, "we lasted 8 hours against 47 enemy warships. I think that might be some kind of record." Dr. Miles laughed, despite the blood on her hands and the wounded crew members lying in her makeshift hospital. "Leave it to humans to find the bright side of certain death." On his flagship, Admiral Zethkar stared at the human vessel with something approaching awe. The ship was clearly finished, no longer a threat to anyone, but somehow she was still there, still defiant, still refusing to surrender even though surrender was the only logical choice. His communications officer turned toward him with confusion written across his scaled features. "Sir, the human ship is not requesting quarter. They are not surrendering." Zeth felt something cold crawl up his spine as he looked at the broken human vessel. In 8 hours of combat, he had learned more about humanity than 2 years of conquest had taught him. These mammals did not think like other species. They did not calculate odds or make logical decisions when faced with certain death. Instead, they simply refused to accept defeat, no matter how hopeless their situation became. Commander Vexton approached with careful steps, his voice barely above a whisper. "Admiral, what are your orders?" The human ship is no longer capable of resistance. For long moments, Zethkar said nothing. He thought about the 25 ships he had lost to a single enemy vessel. He thought about the fear in his warriors' eyes and the way they now hesitated before following orders. He thought about how this battle would be remembered across the galaxy, and what it would mean for the future of his empire, inside the USS Defiance. Captain Morrison stood in the center of his ruined bridge and looked around at the faces of his crew. These men and women had followed him through 8 hours of impossible combat, and not one of them had asked him to surrender. They were ready to die rather than give up, and their courage humbled him more than any medal or commendation ever could. "Captain," Chief Petty Officer Martinez called out from the damage control station, "emergency power is failing. We have maybe 10 minutes before life support shuts down completely." Morrison nodded and opened a channel to the entire ship. His voice carried to every deck and every compartment where his people waited for whatever came next. "This is the captain speaking. We have fought the good fight, and we have shown the galaxy what humans are made of. Whatever happens now, remember that we never gave up." The crew of the USS Defiance faced their final moments with the same quiet courage they had shown throughout the battle. They were not heroes from ancient stories or perfect soldiers from recruitment posters. They were ordinary people who had done extraordinary things when the situation demanded it, and they were proud of what they had accomplished. Admiral Zethkar made his decision with the weight of galactic history pressing down on his shoulders. The human ship was helpless now, no longer a threat to his strategic objectives. But the cost of destroying her had been too high, and the lesson she had taught his warriors was too dangerous to ignore. "Signal the fleet," he said quietly, his voice carrying across the bridge like a death sentence for his own ambitions. "All ships are to disengage and withdraw to hyperspace." The silence that followed his words was broken only by the hum of ship systems and the distant sound of weapons powering down. His officers stared at him with expressions that mixed relief with disbelief. In 2 years of conquest, they had never retreated from any battle, no matter how costly. "Sir," Commander Vexton said carefully, "are you certain? The human vessel cannot escape or call for reinforcements." Zethkar turned away from the tactical display and walked toward his private quarters. "The battle is over, Commander. We came here to demonstrate our power, but instead we have learned the limits of it. Execute my orders." As the Korthax fleet began to pull back from the battle zone, the crew of the USS Defiance watched through damaged sensors and broken viewports. They had expected to die fighting, but somehow they were still alive. The enemy was leaving, and they had won through nothing more than their refusal to surrender. Lieutenant Rodriguez checked her readings 3 times before she trusted what she was seeing. "Captain, the enemy fleet is jumping to hyperspace. All ships are withdrawing from the system." The bridge erupted in cheers that echoed through the corridors and compartments of the dying ship. They had faced impossible odds and somehow emerged victorious, not through superior firepower or brilliant tactics, but through simple human stubbornness carried to its logical extreme. "Captain." Morrison allowed himself a small smile as he watched the last enemy ship disappear into hyperspace. The USS Defiance would probably never fly again, and it would take months to repair the damage they had suffered. But Terra Nova was safe, and more importantly, the galaxy had learned something new about humanity. The story of this battle would spread across known space like wildfire, carried by both human and alien voices. It would inspire resistance movements on occupied worlds and give hope to species facing extinction at Korthak's hands. But most importantly, it would serve as a warning to any force that thought humanity could be easily conquered. Dr. Miles worked to save the lives of crew members who had given everything for their ship and their species. Chief Engineer Walsh began the long process of keeping their vessel alive long enough for rescue ships to arrive. Lieutenant Commander Barnes nursed his damaged controls and dreamed of flying again among the stars. The USS Defiance hung in space like a monument to human determination. She was broken and scarred, held together by emergency power and the will of her crew. But she had held the line when everything depended on it, and she had shown the galaxy that some things were worth any price in the years that followed. The Battle of Terra Nova would become legend. Songs would be written about the ship that refused to die and the crew that refused to surrender. Military academies would study the tactics used, and philosophers would debate the meaning of courage in the face of certain defeat. But for the survivors of the USS Defiance, the real victory was simpler than legend or philosophy. They had faced the darkness and emerged with their humanity intact. They had proven that sometimes the greatest weapon was not technology or numbers, but the simple refusal to give up when everything seemed hopeless. The galaxy would remember this day, and it would remember that nothing had stopped the Korthax Empire until a human warship refused to fall.